When we take a look at Ramayana and Mahabharata, what are the core lessons that each one is trying to teach us?
I think both are teaching us the same lessons. You could call them your rajas, you could call them powerful, you could call them gods. They all went through ups and downs in life. We learn lessons from their lives and we don't repeat it. And that is where Mahabharata Ramayana come in.
Help us understand the journey of Mahabharata.
The most famous is the Bhagavad Gita, which happens between Krishna and Arjuna. Where there is life, there will be problems. What the outcome is not in your hands.
So now coming to the entire episode of Ramayana, what are the lessons that we can learn from that?
So eventually it boils down to the same thing. What do you do when you are faced with ethical dilemmas? So all that happens, finally it's a nice happy ending, they come back to Ayodhya. And there's a huge controversy about what happens after they become Raja Rani.
Is there also another perspective that the purpose of this entire journey was for Ravan to get killed?
In some sense, yes.
The 4 Vedas that are there, right? What are the lessons that we can learn from that?
So Vedas are basically treasure troves of knowledge. The 3 Vedas actually deal with the fire rituals and stuff. Atharva Veda is a little different. It has lots of suktas on medicines. It talks about the structure of governance. So you get a very good idea of what life also would have been at that time.
Is it a misconception or is it the truth that Atharvana Veda is compared to a lot of destruction? People speaking about how Hitler took away the Veda and he started to understand how to destroy the world through that. There were certain
That's absolute bull. In fact, his Haken Kruz, people make it sound as if that's a swastik.
Yes.
That Haken Kruz is actually a Christian symbol. What Hitler did think of himself was that he was an Aryan.
I think today's conversation is going to be more from a perspective of curiosity because I'm the kind of a person who's heard stories of Mahabharata, Ramayana from different sources. Sometimes it is slightly contradictory and sometimes we don't even know the true essence of it. So it's going to come from a space of absolute curiosity and to genuinely understand the essence and meaning behind it from somebody who's done such deep and intense work on that. So I'm sure there are going to be a lot of people like me at this space being confused, just watching certain series or serials about this. If you have to deconstruct, let's go start with Mahabharata. If you have to deconstruct it, help us understand the journey of Mahabharata.
So let me talk about both Mahabharata and Ramayana. In the Indic scriptures, what we call religious scriptures, because we see Mahabharata, Ramayana as religious texts, so to say, right? Because we talk about Ram and Krishna who are our gods. That's why it's a religious scripture. But by and large, if you look at the landscape of Hindu religious scriptures, we don't have one book. We have lots of them, starting from Ved, Upanishads, which is called the Shruti literature. Then we have what is called the Smriti literature. Okay, so Hindu religious landscape, scriptural landscape, 2 broad categories, Shruti and Smriti. Shruti means that which was heard. Basically, we say that our rishis, in their state of meditation, the truth of the universe came to them.
That isn't Shruti.
That they captured as the Vedas and the Upanishads. Okay, which has rituals and everything, but a lot of mantras and all of that. It was not man-made, so to say. Today, if say I have a book, I'll say this book, Mahabharata and Ramayana, Ami Ganatra. Okay. So I say I have written it. Now that's the humility of the rishis who basically said that such knowledge of life exists. We are only a medium to manifest it to others. So they're not claiming IP on it. Okay. That's such a large-heartedness, right? They're saying this knowledge exists and anybody who can go deep into that state of meditation and focus, they will be able to access this knowledge, which is the truth, the ultimate truth. So they captured it into what is called Vedas.
So the ultimate truth of humans and how the world operates.
Everything.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's what it is said. That is why the Vedas are called apaurushaya, not man-made, but that which came through. The medium is still the human being only. Mediums are still rishis, but we are saying that knowledge is not created. Nobody is claiming that this is mine.
Okay.
This exists. You are a medium to access that knowledge. That's what they say. So that is Ved Upanishad. which is the Shruti, because they heard it or they saw it, whatever, it came to them. Then you have what is called as Smriti. Smriti means memory.
Okay.
Basically, everything else that was then created by human beings. Okay, created in the sense it was put down or passed on or composed by human beings. And a lot of those built on the Shruti literature, built on the Vedas. So there is some connection always. So in that now, in the Smriti literature, you have something called as Vedangas, Veda Angas, limbs of Ved. The Vedic language is Sanskrit, but it's old Vedic Sanskrit, not the Sanskrit we know today.
Okay.
So to access the Vedas, especially when people are learning it, chanting it, there are different skill sets that they require. Right pronunciation, okay? Right meter to sing it in. Because it was all chanted, it was all oral, it was not written down, right? So the chanting has to be perfect. The pronunciations has to be perfect. Then you have to understand the words, because I said it's old Vedic Sanskrit, different from now. To understand what is being said, you need to know the meanings of those words.
Correct.
Right? So like that, we have 6 limbs of the Vedas.
Okay.
Which are called Vedangas, which are very important for anybody who wants to go deep into the study of the Vedas. That's what they say.
Okay.
Vedas also have some rituals, like we used to do yagnas and everything,
Correct.
right? So to understand that, when they should happen, more details on that, that all comes under the Vedangas.
Vedangas.
Yeah.
Okay.
So all those, there are 6, they come under that. Then we have one more category, which is called Darshan.
Darshan.
Now, Darshan, very simply translated, becomes philosophy. Okay. But Darshan is not just philosophy. Darshan means, Darsha is to see. Okay. But to see what? We say the ultimate reality. What does it mean? Now everybody has a different view on it, right? What is the ultimate reality? Is this physical body the ultimate reality? If it were, then this should be it, right?
Yeah.
But we see that we take birth and we go away, and that is true for everything else. So that which doesn't stay cannot be the ultimate truth.
Yes.
Then what is the ultimate truth? How do you access it? What is the relation of us with that truth? Now, this is so abstract that there is no one answer to it. So there are multiple schools which developed to find answers to it in different ways.
Okay.
Okay?
To find the answer for the ultimate truth.
Ultimate reality, ultimate truth, and our relation with that.
Okay.
Also existential questions. Ki, acha, how do I access that? What is the purpose of this life? All of this. At one point, maybe there were multiple schools. Finally, they got systematized into what we call 6 darshanas. Now, these 6 darshans are what 6 are the astik darshanas. In the sense, they accept the authority of the Vedas.
Okay.
Okay, but we have others also. For example, the Buddhism, Jainism, they also are a part of the darshans. But they are what we call Nastik darshans. They don't accept the authority of the Vedas. They have their own scriptures developed over time. Okay, and then one of it is called Charvak. Charvak basically says, this is what this life is. There is nothing beyond this. No rebirth. No, nothing. What you see is the truth, and there is nothing beyond the truth. This material life is the truth.
What is it
that
called?
Is a philosophy. Charvak.
Okay.
So it's very. If you see today's world, right? Most of us live like that. One life, what we call the one life, YOLO.
Okay.
You live only one life phenomenon. That goes back that long ago. It's not. We always think it's a new modern thing, right? But we've always had those people.
Right.
So that's the Charvak philosophy.
Okay.
So those are called darshans. And when I say darshan and when I say schools, there have been debates and scriptures and thoughts and everything written on these. So it used to be a culture which was widely debated, discussed, and everybody trying to prove that theirs is the final word and that's the right truth. And debating and then improving themselves and stuff. So this is the darshan part of it. Sorry, I'm going into this detail.
No, please go ahead with this.
What has happened is I have just recently finished a manuscript on this. So a book is going to come out. So it's all fresh in my head.
I mean, I love the way you're explaining, and my curiosity in this is just expanding so much just listening to this. So now I want to understand 2 things. One is Shruti, one is Smriti, the other one is Darshan. So
no, Darshan is in the Smriti.
Oh, Darshan. Okay, got it.
Now Smriti, within that you have Vedangas.
Correct.
You have Darshan.
Okay.
You have what we call the Dharma Shastras. You know, people keep talking about Manusmriti.
Yes.
Some people are burning it. Some people are saying it's the ultimate truth and stuff. There is no one Smriti. People make it sound as if in India there was only one Smriti and code of conduct and everybody lived by that. No. Manusmriti is just one of the Dharma Shastras. Now, what are Dharma Shastras? See, what happens is Ved talks about this philosophical abstract truth, some rituals, all of that, yeah? Darshan talks about the ultimate reality. Vedangas talk about how to access the Vedas. But to live life in a society, you need certain code of conduct, right? You need different people to do different activities. There is interdependency. Now, if there are people, there will be crime. You have to punish, right? You need some Raja. The Raja has certain duties to do. Something needs, a society needs certain norms, certain code of conduct, right? Just abstract philosophy doesn't help. Only puja part doesn't help. So then, over time, what got created based on what were the norms and what our rishis saw as the ideal state. Based on that, certain works were created to help the Raja and to help the society live in a way that they don't kill each other and fight over each other.
Okay.
To live in a law and order based state, to live with virtues and morals and all of that, yeah? For those texts are called Dharma Shastras.
Okay.
And there is no one. Manusmriti is one. Then you have Yagnivalkya Smriti, you have Parashar Smriti. And it's not as if they agree on all points. They differ also. So there are lots of these. Like for example, today we have a constitution. This constitution is binding on everybody, right? At that time, these were sort of constitutions, but not in the sense of constitution today. Today, every constitution, we have to live by it. Those were guiding frameworks for the Raja. Then the Raja might take a call based on his state, based on his people, based on the community, what he wants to apply, what he doesn't want to apply, what he wants to change.
But when you follow these principles that were given, the goal of the principles was to help people access that consciousness?
This one is more practical.
Okay, to make sure everybody lives a cordial life.
Yeah.
Okay.
See, what happens when there are no rules and regulations? Everybody will just do whatever they want, right? For example, see, when we don't follow the traffic rules, what happens?
Correct.
एक car यहाँ से आती है, एक वहाँ से आती है, something happens. Nobody can really live properly. You're always scared. You never know what is going to go away. Somebody will take away something from you. So we always want a law and order based society where justice is served, there is peace, and there is opportunity to grow. Grow how? Materially, but also spiritually, right? But for that, you need a society which is living in peace and happily with each other. How do you establish that society? That is more real. Not abstract, more real, like we need it today.
So you
Those
said,
are Dharma Shastras.
So in Dharma Shastras, there are different categories, is what you said. Let's assume you are a Raja and I am a Raja. And let's say you are naturally inclined to one kind of a Dharma Shastra and I'm inclined to another kind. What makes you inclined towards one aspect and what makes me inclined towards another aspect?
I think the inclinations would come from what your legacy is. Okay. So there are certain things in Dharma Shastras which are common. In the sense, what should be the duty of the Raja? To take care of everyone, to ensure there is welfare of everyone, to ensure there is justice. How is justice served? All those are going to be by and large common, right? Because the Raja's duty is to ensure welfare and protection. Where does it change? It changes in terms of some Dharma Shastra will say, the different communities have very strict separation. This person should do only this. This person should do only this, right? The other Dharma Shastras will say, no, not like that. People are free to choose and maybe there is overlap and you take a call based on your requirement.
Got it.
Right? Then some will say, women have a specific role, men have a specific role. They will get inheritance. Somebody say they'll not get inheritance. Things like this.
Okay.
This could change, right? Now, these things are not about morality. These things are about your ongoing practice and eventually what the king believes is the right mode. So, what does that depend on? Your own upbringing? You might have seen that in your Rajya, the women have largely been free and doing what they want. So, you'll be inclined towards one. Also, over time, right? You might have a very strict separation at one point. With time, technologies have changed. You might change. So it's never been like written in stone.
Okay.
These were guidelines.
Okay.
You could choose, you could not. In fact, they say themselves that with Desha Kala, depending on the place, depending on time, these things could evolve.
Okay, got
So
it.
that is how the Dharma Shastras are. And you will have some texts like say Chanakya's Arthashastra, which is a later day text. Now what it says is, the Manusmriti says XYZ, Parashar school says YZ, Naiti Kautilya. I don't agree with both of this. I am saying this is how it should be done. Yeah. So it was not as if they were stagnant
Okay.
and there was no growth over it. ऐसा नहीं था.
It is evolved.
Because societies evolve, right?
Right.
And these things have to evolve.
Right.
So that's what Dharma Shastras are. Then you have two other categories, which is coming to your answer, Itihas
Okay.
and Puran.
Itihas and Puran.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now, Itihas are the two texts we are talking about. Mahabharat and Ramayana. And Purans are Vishnu Puran, Shiva Puran, Skanda Puran,
Okay.
Matsya Puran, all of those, which are called Puran, they are all of those. So, broadly, this is the landscape of the Hindu Shastras. So, I call it the Hindu Shastra pantheon. This is what
Okay.
it is. Okay. Now, Itihas talks about Krishna, Ram, okay, and Puran talks about all other gods. Now, what is the difference? Why is this called Itihas and why are the Purans called Puran? Puran means very old.
Okay.
That is, very simply, Puran means something that is very, very old. Itihas simply means history.
Okay.
Okay. Itihasa. This has happened before. So it was. This is the translation.
It has happened before?
So
Okay.
it was. Iti, so, hasa. Ha, asa.
Okay.
Asa is to be.
Okay.
But past tense of it. So
Okay.
it was. And they define the itihas as Purva Vruttam Kathayuktam. Purva Vruttam means something that has happened in the past, narrated in a Katha format.
Okay.
This claim is not made for Puran.
Okay.
Okay. So that is the biggest difference.
Okay.
Also, the two epics, Itihas, Mahabharata and Ramayana, who composed them? These were the rishis who were contemporary to those times. Okay, so Valmiki ji was alive in the times of Rajaram.
Okay.
He has seen him. He has met him.
Okay.
He was alive during that time. And he's documenting the life of the king when he was alive.
Okay.
Who was so good that his history needs to be told to people. Why? Dharma, Artha, Kam, Mokshanam, Upadesham, Samanvitam. So that the lessons of life, of all aspects, Dharma, how to live your life righteously, virtuously, right? Artha is meaning, but Artha in this case means resources, money.
Okay.
We all need money to live, no? Without money, we cannot survive. So the money aspect of it. But how should you earn? In the right manner, in a way that is sustainable, not with exploiting people. Yeah, without that, but you need money. So generating resources. Karma, pleasure. Life is not all drab and dry. You need pleasure, and pleasure has a purpose. If there was no attraction between men and women, there wouldn't be any procreation. You need procreation. You need pleasure to continue life properly, right? So that is also important. Well-being is also important. That's the aspect of karma. And moksha, chalo, it's the eventual spiritual goal. So to teach us the lessons of life holistically from the life of our ancestors,
Okay.
that is Itihas.
Okay.
Okay. So Valmiki ji writes about Sri Ram, who's alive in his time, and Ved Vyas ji writes about the Pandavas and Kauravas, which we now call Mahabharata.
Okay.
Right? Now, who were Pandavas and Kauravas? They are the direct descendants, the bloodline of Ved Vyas ji.
Okay.
So he's talking of the history of his own children.
Okay.
Vedvyas is the father of Dhritarashtra, Pandu and Vidur.
Okay.
Because their mothers, as in Vichitra Virya, who was the husband of Ambika and Ambalika, he had died. So these children are born through Niyoga. What happens is, in our scriptures, we are told that the institution of marriage, the core of the institution of marriage, or at the center of the institution of marriage is a child. It was for procreation, yeah, and resource generation. So now, if say a husband dies very young, and the wives are also young, do they don't have any right to have children? Today it would be like, oh, how can
Yeah.
you, right? At that time, that was not the case. A special provision was made, which was called Niyoga, through which, if say the husband has died young without a child, or the husband is impotent,
Okay.
then with the permission of the wife, permission of the husband if he is alive, or the permission of the family if the husband has died, they could call one man to impregnate the women.
Okay.
Okay, but it was not for lust. It
Okay.
was with a goal of having a child. Like today, what we would do, we'll have sperm donors.
Correct.
Right? That time, they didn't have a donor bank.
Got it.
So it was like a man would come and you do the process.
Got it. But they wouldn't get married.
No.
Okay.
And the child will get the name of the father, as in
Okay.
the husband of the
Got it.
lady. Yeah?
Got it.
So Ved Vyasji is the actual blood father, although his name is not there. But it is through him that Dhritarashtra is born, Pandu is born, and Vidur is born. And Kauravas, Duryodhana and his brothers, are the sons of Dhritarashtra. And Pandavas, Yudhishthira and everybody, they are the sons of Pandu.
Okay.
So in that sense, they are the grandsons
Correct.
of Ved Vyasji, right? And the story of Mahabharata, or whatever happens, the history of Mahabharata is narrated to us by Ved Vyasji. He's basically telling us the story of his own children who fought, why they fought, how it happened, what it led to, what was the outcome, how the decisions were made. He's telling us story of his own people. Why? So that we learn lessons from their life and we don't repeat it. So that is Itihas. Okay, and that is where Mahabharata, Ramayana come in.
That's so intense and so interesting.
Yeah.
I really think a lot of people should understand it from this perspective because there are so many layers to this, right? So when we take a look at Ramayana and Mahabharata, what are the core lessons that each one is trying to teach us?
I think both are teaching us the same lessons.
Okay.
Okay, people have different views on it, but that is largely because they've not read the original Valmiki Ramayana or Ved Vyasji's Mahabharata.
Okay.
What happens is both these stories have people have loved these stories and they've rewritten, retold. Yeah, different people have had different views on it and stuff. Because of which the original are pretty much forgotten. Nobody reads them. And the idea we have of Valmiki, of Ramayana and Mahabharata is based on retellings. But if you go back to the original, these are the few lessons which I take away. One, where there is life, there will be problems. Come what may. You could call them your rajas, you could call them powerful, you could call them gods. They all went through ups and downs in life. Yeah, it just happens that this is what life is. When such situations arise, you have to take decisions. There is no running away from decisions, especially if you're a leader. Yeah. How do you take those decisions will determine what the outcomes are. But once you've taken a decision, what the outcome is not in your hands. So it is important from what position you take those decisions. Are you taking those decisions impulsively? I like it, I don't like it, I'm jealous of him. Or are you taking those decisions thoughtfully? Not just for yourself, but everybody else involved. Thinking about what the potential consequences could be. Controlling your mind and doing what is right instead of what you want. Still, the outcome could be whatever. But if you have thought through well, you will be in a better position to accept that outcome. Because the outcome will come what may, whatever way you take the decision. And once the outcome comes, you may like it or you don't like it. You have to live with it. Basically, in everybody's life, there are problems. Everybody will go through ethical dilemma. How do you deal with those will depend on your value systems. So what is important in life? To start developing those value systems so that you can do your best in those ethical dilemmas and at least don't regret whatever is the outcome. Very simply.
So both of it speaks the same truth.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Stories are a little different, approaches are different, but the core is exactly the same.
Okay. So now I would like to go slightly more deeper into Vedas and Upanishads before I start asking you more questions on Mahabharata and Ramayana. So the 4 Vedas that are there, right? Like how and why, what is the significance, number one? And the second thing is, how did the download happen for the rishis?
Okay, so Veda, the word itself comes from Vida. Vida means to know. Okay. So Vedas are basically knowledge, like treasure troves of knowledge. Now, your question is, how did the download happen? What we understand is, so even Rigved, it says, the knowledge was out there, the riches were out there. When the rishis meditated in their hearts on that truth, it just came to them. And through their words, because what is the way to manifest? At that time, there was no writing. It is through words. That knowledge came to this world through their words. So they were all in the language of Vedic Sanskrit, in mantras, which later on got compiled into these different Vedas.
Okay.
That is how it is. Now, what is the
4 different Vedas.
So, the Rig Ved is, again, Ved maybe now, when I say Ved, it is 4 Veds, but there are different layers to it as well.
Okay.
So, in one Ved, every Ved, okay, common, you have what is called the Samhita section. Then you have what is called the Brahman section. Then you have Aranyaka Upanishad. It may be clear cut, it may not be clear cut. One might have one might not have another. By and large, this is what it has. What is a Samhita? Samhita are the mantras. Mantras are the ones which are chanted during the fire ritual. Yeah. Rigved has most of those mantras,
Okay.
which are chanted.
Okay.
And the topics could be anything and everything. There is one mantra in Rigved. I mean, it is a religious text, so to say, right? But there is one mantra which is called the Nasadiya Sukta. Na Asat. Nasadiya means Na Asat. The Sukta talks about what could have been the creation process. Yeah. Which is always the question we ask till now, how did it all come to be?
Yes.
So it says, at one point in time, there was no existence and no non-existence. Because for non-existence also, there has to be an existence. Only then you have a non, right? So it has to be beyond all this. Then maybe there was a desire. Because any kind of creation, the first step is that spark of desire. So there was some desire. To who we don't know, but it was there. From that, slowly, all these things came to be. So it says this, okay? It's like a detailed description. Then it says, but how do we know? Maybe the rishis know. How do the rishis know? But because maybe the gods said or gave that information. But how would the gods know? Because the gods also came after creation.
Right.
Then how do we know? We may know, we may not know. This is what it says. Va no va. We may know. This may be how it was, or it may not be. Who knows? Because beyond a point, unless somebody was sitting up there and watching the creation, they would not know. But if they were sitting up there and watching a creation, then that is not the original starting point.
Right. Who created them?
Who created them,
Yeah.
right? So it's an ongoing question.
Yes.
To put this skepticism, to say that, yes, there is a truth, but there could also be something else, right? There is a reason why Hindu Dharma has developed the way it has. We are very open overall, accepting things, yeah, different gods. Also in the Rig Veda, if you see, the gods are not like today's gods we see. They're all nature deities, as it was for most ancient civilizations.
Okay.
You have Agni, fire. You have Indra, which is for rains and all of that. Yeah. You have Vayu. You have the Surya. All of these you worship through the fire ritual. That's the idea. Why? Because our life depended on nature, right? Today with technology, we've been able to pretty much cover our risks with most of the natural issues. Then it was not the case. So you needed to. The idea was that if you need them to be benevolent for you, you have to work in a way that appeases them.
Okay.
So this idea of this ecological balance, right? That you do something for them, and as in you take care of them and they take care of you. That is the whole idea of the yagna that we had.
Okay.
Where you say, okay, we are grateful to you for what you do. Please bless us. And because we are appeasing them, they are taking care of us. Which also means you take what you need, not exploit them unnecessarily. Right? That is the whole idea.
Okay. This is Rig Veda.
This is in general the Vedic thing. Yeah?
Okay.
Rigved has a lot of these mantras, which will you basically chant for Indra, for Varun, for Vayu. Please come and accept our offerings. You are the best. Whatever, take care of us. All of that. The different kinds of suktas and some of these philosophical suktas like the Nasadiya Sukta and stuff as well. It has another theory of creation which is called the Purush Sukta, where it says that this yagna that we see, which we do now, the fire ritual, the cosmic creation was also some kind of a yagna only, where an idea of a human being, yeah, that human being was put as a sacrifice into that ritual, and from different parts of that human, different things emerged. From his legs emerged the dharti, the earth. From his eyes emerged the Surya, the sun and the moon. So like that. So that is also given as an imagery.
Okay.
So different things. So that is what this Rig Veda is. What the Yajurved. So what Yajurved has? Yajurved is to actually do the ritual.
Okay.
Yeah. So if you say there were different kinds of fire rituals. How do you do them? What mantra do you sing? What process do you follow? Stuff like that. So that is more in the Yajurved part of it. Then you have what is called Samaveda. Samaveda, like today, we are sitting here in Chennai. Classical music is such a big thing here, right? The Carnatic music especially. The roots go back to Samaveda. So Samaveda is a musical text. It takes mantra. By and large, most mantras are from Rigved. But they are set to musical tone. So it will say that, okay, this word like Agni Mire Purohitam, this is the first line of the first mantra of Rigved. Agni Mire Purohitam. Now the Samved will say Agni Mire Purohitam. No, this is not exactly how it is, but you get this thing, right? It will set it to a tone that here there has to be Uchcha Swara, here it will be Lesser Swara, here you have to stretch it. So basically you sing it. The idea is you invoke the Devata, okay? Then you call him, do the ritual, and then if you have guests at home, you will entertain them. So this is an entertainment that now you're singing for them so that they get happier, right?
Okay.
So for the process, the three Vedas actually deal with the fire rituals and stuff. Atharva Veda is a little different.
Okay.
Atharva Veda deals with more mundane stuff. Like there will be mantras, but mantras for your physical wealth, your physical health. It has lots of suktas on medicines.
Okay.
It has lots of suktas on taking care of your health. Like how do you, if you have, say, if your bone is broken, what do you do? If you have cholera, what do you do? Not exactly cholera, but that kind of diseases, Jalodhar, what they call. So lots of things dealing with that. Like if you have a snake bite, what do you do? How do you protect yourself from that? So lots of incantations on that. If you want to influence your lover or some boy who you want to influence, so there are suktas around that also.
Okay.
So how do you do that? How do you sing that mantra so that you can do the vashila of that other person?
Okay.
Things like these are also there. It talks about the structure of governance in certain places and how it used to be Sabha and Samiti, how decisions were taken. So there are some indications of that as well. So you get a very good idea of what life also would have been at that time.
How old are these?
To be honest, everybody has different ranges.
Okay.
I personally believe at least 7,000 to 8,000 years old, if not more.
Okay.
But then again, this is just a speculation. We really don't know.
And for example, let's say Rigveda, the download happened to just one Rishi?
No. There are multiple rishis.
Okay.
There are multiple rishis. And multiple as in lots of them. Because what happens is Rigveda, the way we have it right now, there are 10 parts to it. Okay. Those 10 books, of which, if you remove the first one and the last one, so last two. So there are 7 books of that which belong to a particular Rishi family.
Okay.
So for example, third is Vishwamitra family. So Vishwamitra family will be like Vishwamitra and his students and his children. Whatever suktas came to them, it all will be combined together. So even that is not just one Rishi. There are multiple Rishis in that lineage also. Which are students as well as children, because they get the same name as the Rishi. So within a book, there will be multiple. So there are lots of Rishis, not one.
Okay.
And same goes for others.
And is it a misconception or is it the truth that Atharvana Veda is compared to a lot of destruction?
Destruction in the sense?
Like, for example, there's also, people speaking about how Hitler took away the Veda and he started to understand how to destroy the world through that. There were certain
That's absolute bullshit.
Okay.
That is absolute bullshit. We have no proof that Hitler was somehow inspired by Atharva Veda, and Atharva Veda has nothing like that which destroys the world. As I said, it has mundane things.
Right.
Like you want to get something which is not yours and stuff, or you want your lover to love you more.
Okay.
Yeah, some stuff like that, but not everything is like that. Most of it is for good purposes only. What Hitler did think of himself was that he was an Aryan. Okay, people have used that to basically say he got inspired by the Vedas, which is not at all true. In fact, his Haken Cruz, right? Now people make it sound as if that's a swastik.
Yes.
It is
the
not a
inverted
swastik. But it is not the inverted swastik. It has nothing to do with swastik. It has nothing to do with Hinduism at all. The Haken Cruz, in fact, in Mein Kampf, he calls it Haken Cruz, not swastik. That Haken Cruz is actually a Christian symbol. Okay, it has nothing to do with Hinduism. And Hitler was a Christian. But later on, when the translation of Mein Kampf happened in English, they very nicely changed that Hakenkreuz, which is basically a crooked cross. German Hakenkreuz means crooked cross. The translator very nicely made it what? Swastik, inverted swastik. Nothing to do with swastik. So that connection could be made. Arey, these guys are like this. It was all still colonial period, right? At that time.
Right. And you, having studied all the Vedas, if you have to just bottle it down and help us understand, what do Vedas talk about the ultimate purpose of life? What would that be?
As I said, there were 4 parts to it, right? You have the Samhita, which are the mantras and the rituals and all of that. And then eventually you go to Upanishads. Now, what do the Vedas, if we have to take the lesson for it, it is not different from everything else that we learn. First is that you take birth, so you have to live your life in this birth, which includes generation of resources, which includes procreation, which includes, and how do you do all of this? Virtuously, in a way that is non-exploitative, in a way that sustains life, in a way that sustains this world and the universe. That is one part, which is your physical material life. But it doesn't stop there. Okay? Eventually, you have to move beyond that. Because when you talk about reality, what is reality? What is ultimate reality? Which is the truth never changes. Right? But what is not true will change. So, the fact that this body grows up and dies, it is not the ultimate truth. The ultimate truth has to be beyond that. What is that? What is making this body come to life, right? That is what we call Atma. But this Atma, what does it have to do? Like we have an Atma, what is that power which is making this whole world run? Making this whole creation happen, right? What is that truth? Is there some truth? Then what is the ultimate goal of life? To eventually realize that this Atma has to realize that Paramatma Tattva, the real cosmic truth. What that could be is our own journey to figure out. And that is why we have these different paths. So one is living your life in a fulfilling way, all material pleasures, everything, doing your responsibility towards the sustenance of the society and the world, while also then moving beyond that for your spiritual growth.
Is that what is moksha?
That is moksha.
Okay.
When you when you get the final realization, when you become one in one's, if you are a Advaitin, you'll be like it's the same. You just identify with that. If you are a Advaitin, you'll be like you reach to the God, the ultimate reality. You get there, but it's still different. Vishishta Advait would be that you are a part of that whole and you merge into that whole. So different schools will say different things, but it's
the
about that
essence
ultimate.
is the same.
Essence is the same.
Okay. And do you also believe different people have attained enlightenment through different processes? Let's say Buddha did it with Vipassana and Ramana Maharshi did it with self-inquiry. Do you believe that everything is kind of taking us to the same point?
There is a beautiful sukta in the Rig Veda which says, Ekam Sat Bahuda Vipra Vadanti. There is one truth. People talk about it in different ways. People approach it in different ways. But eventually, it is one. So this truth or this realization has been mentioned in the Rig Veda itself. And it also says, Ano Bhadra Kritvo Yantu Vishwataha. Let good thoughts, let good learnings, let good messages come to me from everywhere. Whatever it is, let me not become dogmatic about anything. Whatever there is good to learn from everywhere, let all those thoughts come to me. It's very, very open-minded in that sense.
Interesting.
It says that truth is one. Everybody will realize in different ways depending on where they are in their spiritual path, right? It's like if you are on a mountain, you reach the peak going from anywhere, no?
Correct.
So that's how it is.
And in this entire journey, how would you kind of differentiate the essence of free will and destiny?
Very interesting. So in the Mahabharata and the Ramayana also, there is a lot of discussion around this. That what is free will, what is destiny? How do you manage all of this, right? So there is a conversation in the Mahabharata between Bhishma and Yudhishthira after the war. And they are talking about Purushartha and Bhagya. Bhagya is your destiny. Purushartha is your action. So basically, how much impact does destiny have? He says something very interesting. He's like, think of it as the bhumi, the land, and the seed. Okay? If you want the crop to grow, you need to till the land, okay? And you need to put the seed. If you put the seed, but don't till the land, don't give it water, will the tree come out?
No.
But if you put this, if you till the land but don't put the seed, again it won't come out, right? So you need both. You need to till, which is your purushartha, and you need the seed, which is an aspect of bhagya. But without the combination of those two, no outcome will come. And you will never know what that destiny is unless you actually do the tilling and you put the effort, right? And that effort putting is clearly your will.
Right.
So he says that don't worry about the bhagya because that is not in your hands. What is in your hands? Your purushartha, your hard work, based on whatever visibility you have. Keep doing that. If not one plant, something else will happen. Who knows?
And the will to take action, is it also influenced by our samskaras that we carry?
Absolutely.
Okay.
But I also believe that samskaras can also change over time if you have the will.
It's interesting. So first, help us understand, for people who don't understand what samskaras are, help us understand what samskaras
So see, we all, like you and I, right? Do you like sweets?
Yeah.
I don't.
Okay.
Why?
We don't know.
But it is what it is.
Yes.
Right? This is a very physical manifestation of a sanskar.
Okay.
You are just, your system is such which makes you like sweets. I don't. Is there any, I mean, how do you explain this, right? It's there. You are born with that, I'm born with that. Now, it is possible that over time, if I eat something which I've not eaten before and suddenly I like it, yeah? Or something happens and you are told don't eat sweets. And you just give up over time and then you lose any interest in that, right? That might also happen. So with effort, that could also change. It's the same with samskaras. So what are samskaras? Samskaras are the inherent impulses that we are born with. See, there are some people who naturally gravitate towards art. There are some who naturally are good at numbers, right? So it is your samarthya also, your capabilities also depend on what some of your sanskaras are. Is it always in the upbringing? Some of it is definitely in the upbringing, right? But not everything. Because if everything was just upbringing, same family members, everybody would be the same, but that is also not true, right? Also, if it was only Janma, then also one family, everybody would be the same, but that is also not true.
Right.
So it's always both. It is nature and it is nurture. That which defined you as a person. Samskaras are which come with your nature. It could be because of your past karmas, as we believe. It could be because of the genes, but it could be a mix of a lot of things. Those are sanskaras.
Okay.
Now, how you act, like you asked, right? How you act obviously depends on that, both nurture and your inherent nature. But as I said, the nature itself can change. And the way we are told in the Gita, for example, or just the Indic view, we are all a part of three gunas, sattva, rajas, tamas. We are all in that spectrum. There is nobody who has only sattva or who has only tamas. We are all in that spectrum. And that spectrum itself, we can change. Within a day, we'll be at different points. If at night, we'll have more tamas. The day, we are more active, more rajas, right? Phases of life, it might change. Very proactively, we can change. If there was no free will, no change can ever happen.
So now, does that mean, for example, let's say, irrespective of the sanskaras that we carry, do we all have the bhagya, which is the destiny, that all of us have the potential of attaining that moksha in this lifetime?
According to our scriptures, everybody has access to moksha. In this lifetime or in which lifetime, we can't say. But does everyone have access to moksha? Yes. In fact, I was telling you about darshan, right? So one of our philosophies, which is Sankhya. So Sankhya says, what is the goal of birth? Okay, what is the goal of this birth in general? So it says, the goal of this janma or a being is bhoga and apavarga. Bhoga is to enjoy this life. Enjoy as in experience everything. This physical world that you see. And apavarga. And then eventually head to moksha. This is the purpose of this life, it says. Which is for everybody. And not just human beings. Not just human beings. It is for everything that takes birth.
If this is the purpose of life, why do you think once we are born here, we kind of forget all of this and live in chaos?
See, that is the rasa of it also, right?
And what creates the karmic cycles here that does not let us reach the moksha point?
In fact, the karmic cycles are the free will, right? We are born with certain sanskaras, but how we act in a certain situation, that comes from your free will. It has an impact of the sanskaras, but you always have the choice. Whatever action you have taken intentionally will have a repercussion. That is your karmic cycle.
Okay, you either nullify what had happened so that you go back zero, or you add more and you take back more.
Correct. Now, what is that? So, how do we understand that? So, again, there is a beautiful story which comes in the Shanti Parva in Mahabharata. So, there is a lady whose young son is killed by a snake. And the neighbors come and they're like, oh, where is the snake? This snake needs to be punished. It killed this bacha, right? The mother is like, no, let it be, jane do. And they're like, Arey, why are you saying this? So they run around to find the snake. But the snake is like, I didn't kill it. You cannot blame me for killing it because my nature is to bite. All I did was I bit him, right? I did not have control over that nature. So I am not responsible. Then they're like, oh, who did it? So eventually it goes back to, oh, who's responsible then? Maybe Kal. And Kal is like, yeah, but then Kal depends on your own actions. So your repercussion is based on your own actions. So then eventually this guy is dealt with whatever he's dealt with because of his own actions. That is what they come to.
Okay.
However, the point to see here is when the snake is saying that, oh, I didn't kill it. I was only acting according to my swabhava. What does that mean? It simply means if, say, a man stabs another person and the person dies, will you punish the knife?
No.
The knife could have been used to cut vegetables or to kill somebody, right? So whose intentionality it was? The man's. And hence the man gets punished. Now to achieve moksha, we are said, be like a knife. In the sense, in Gita, Arjuna is like, oh, how can I do this? How can I do that? Krishna tells him, Baba, do what is your dharma, what is your duty. You have to do that. And your duty is to establish righteousness, do dharma sansthapan. Those people were vile. You need to punish them because of what they have done. After all the peace efforts, they still continue to be bad. So hence you need to do that. And he's still worried, how do I do that? What if I get papa and stuff? And Krishna says, Nimitta matra bhava sabhyasachi. Don't worry about what is the outcome. That is not in your hands. What is in your hands? To do what you must do. To do what is your duty. But how do you do it? Without hating them. Without anger. You do it because you must do it. Play your role in this world as the nimitta, as the instrument of the divine will. Okay. Which basically means you don't do or not do something because you're like, oh, what if something happens to me? Or what happens to my people? Or, oh my God, I'll lose my people. No, you do it because that is your duty based on what your position is. Irrespective of what the outcome is, irrespective of thinking, oh, what if I'm happy, what if I'm sad? No. You need to do it because that is the right thing to do. That is the divine will which has given you that duty. Can you do it without being disturbed or being taken astray by these thoughts of outcome? Because you should do it without attachment. Don't kill them because you hate them and you want to kill them. No. You have to kill them as a duty. They are wrongdoers and you are the Raja. You have to do your duty. Simple. Without being attached to that. Not killing them, you are attached to them and hence you are not killing them. Or killing them with that attachment, I hate them. Both is wrong.
So generally for people to take action in any direction, there is a desire that is there and they look out for an outcome of the desire and in their mind, they're like, okay, this is how I'm going to feel when that desire manifests for me in my life. So now in this entire journey, the biggest challenge that people have is being detached from the outcome. How can somebody be inspired to do something in their life and at the same time be detached from the outcome?
Beautiful. Let's go to Gita. Okay, one of the most well-known shloka of Gita. Do you know which is that?
No.
Karmanyeva adhikaraste ma phaleshu kadachana.
Okay.
Krishna says, you have the right over your action. Karmani eva. Karma is action. You have the right over your action. Karmani eva adhikaraste. Eva is only. On your action, only adhikara. You have the right. Ma phaleshu kadachana. Not over its outcome. Okay. But why is it so? He explains it in another chapter. He says, siddhi or siddhi, success or failure, eventually whatever is the outcome is, he says it depends on 5 things. Karta, Karana, Prithakvidha Cheshtha, Adhishthana, and the 5th one. So what are these 4? Karta is the doer. Say somebody has to build a bridge. You need an engineer to do it who has the knowledge of it. If you get somebody who does not understand, the work is going to fail, no? Whatever intention jane do, but there is no capability in the doer itself, it will fail. You have the best of the engineers, but you don't have the resources only. Your cement is bad, your machinery is bad. Will the outcome happen however good your karta is?
No.
So you need the right resources for it. There is a process to do the bridge, right? First you put the cement and whatever, then you let it dry for a few days, then you do it again. Now if somebody says, no, I don't want to let it dry, I'll just do it and I'll go to the next step. Will it work? Whatever good machinery, whatever good karta won't work. So you need to follow the process. When you have chosen to build the bridge, you also have to look at what is the geological, the earthquake frequency here and all of that. So the surrounding conditions, you have to see all that. If you don't see that, the best of the bridges will collapse. Right? So that is the adhishthan. Now after doing everything, suddenly a tsunami hits. What do? You've taken care of everything. Yeah? You have the best of the earthquake measures in place, everything. But suddenly you have the worst of the tsunamis ever, which has never happened before. What do? Could you have planned for it?
No.
But it happened. Right? However, the tsunami may not happen. And you will have a bridge which lasts for say 50 years. Right? Could you have ever planned for the eventual outcome? What can you plan for? A bridge that lasts for 50 years?
Yes.
How can you do that? By putting your best foot forward.
Yes.
Now, say the tsunami goes away, then what should the engineer do? Jump in the well and die because, the outcome was not according to me. But if the bridge collapses within the first year, then there is clearly an issue with the engineer, right? So what should he aim for? What should it be that inspires the engineer or the doer?
To get better.
To get better and build the best bridge he can.
Yes.
Now, possible something else happens.
Right.
Right? Why should he be worried about the outcome in that sense? Talk about the present outcome. You try for the best.
Right.
It's the action that should itself be the inspiration.
I think the beauty lies in the process and the gratification is in the process. So now in Mahabharata, right, the major conversation between Krishna and Arjuna, what are the key lessons and the most powerful conversations that happened between them?
So, well, Mahabharata has lots of them. The most famous is the Bhagavad Gita, which happens between Krishna and Arjuna. Now, what is the situation? Arjuna has to fight a battle where he's one of the most important warriors. Okay? The victory or the loss of the Pandavas depends on Arjuna. I mean, others are also very good, but by and large, Arjuna is somebody they all depend on. Now, this war hadn't just suddenly happened. There was a huge background to it, where the Pandavas have consistently tried to avoid it at the expense of undergoing hardship as well, living through hardships as well. At the cost of saying that, Baba, you take our entire kingdom, just give us 5 villages to survive. They are willing to compromise even on that. But the other side is hell-bent on a war. Okay. Other side is still family. It's an extended family. It's the cousins. But Duryodhan, the man on the other side, he's like, it is not about the land or anything. He's so jealous of the Pandavas. Duryodhan has everything. He has a kingdom, he has prosperity, everything. He has people who are good friends to him, everything. But his entire life is only about pulling the Pandavas down or eliminating them. Rather than focusing on what he has, he is more concerned about what they shouldn't have and what they shouldn't enjoy. Yeah. So he wants the war. Okay. Now, if you have a bully like that, who's just not willing to compromise or negotiate or let you live in peace and is hell-bent on killing you, what do? then it is injustice, right? How much injustice can you take? Because now he's doing that to you. Later on, he might do that to somebody else if you let a bully have your way. So then, for especially a Raja who has to establish a virtuous society, you cannot have the mafia and the bully to have their way. So you have to punish them, which is through this war. It is not as if Arjun doesn't know all this. It's not as if Arjun doesn't know the background, right? And it is not as if Arjun is scared, because Arjun has fought many wars in his life. But that time, just before the war is going to start, he is completely devastated. Why? Because on the other side are not just Duryodhan and his cousins, but also the people he loves and he respects. His Pitama, grandfather Bhishma, his guru, his uncles, other cousins who are not even bad, right? And he's like, what am I doing this for and why? Now at that point, he's forgetting why he's fighting the war. And he's saying, oh, what will I get out of it? Just the kingdom. Yeah, is this just for the kingdom that I'm fighting? Then it's better if I die rather than killing all these people. The whole aspect that this war has been necessitated by the jealousy of Duryodhan and his bulliness, which has brought them here, he's forgotten. And he's thinking, acha, what if I even win? Only I'll get that kingdom at the cost of all of this. What he's not thinking about, the precedent he would set by running away, right? At this point, Krishna then tells him, Baba, you cannot run away. You have to stand here and fight. Mota mota, or in essence, this is what it is. Okay. But at that point, given the mindset of Arjun, he's so unhappy, he's so sad and dejected, right? To convince him or to show him the light that why are you fighting this war and how should you fight this war? First is why. Yeah, why should you fight it? Because it's your duty. But how to fight it? You are fighting it because it's a dharma yuddha. Yeah, and all that he explains that what is your dharma? You are a kshatriya, you need to establish all of that. But second, also don't worry about the outcome. Now, how do you do your kartavya without worrying about the outcome? That is where then the whole detachment goes to, right? That is where then the aspect of faith comes. That you trust me, trust my word, come to me, surrender to that divine will. All these lessons come. But why have all these come? To get him in that mind state to do his duty. Basically, Arjun is faced at that point with a huge ethical dilemma.
Okay.
One is his duty towards his family. The other is the larger goal of setting up a virtuous society. Okay. Now, clearly, we all have a duty towards our family to ensure that the family survives, vagera, vagera, right? So, what Arjun is saying is, I won't be fulfilling that duty of mine. If I kill everybody, what will happen? People will become helpless. It will be all anarchy in my family, right? And if you see Hindu families, we do Shraddh for our ancestors and stuff. All that will stop. What will happen to my ancestors? My family will get destroyed. So he's saying that I'll be failing my family by killing them or by doing this war. He's forgotten about his larger goal. Krishna is saying, Baba, yes, all this is going to happen. Yeah, all this will obviously happen, and it happened, right? But there is a larger goal here. Now, when there are two conflicting priorities, how do you decide? It's not easy, right? So to get him to take a right call between two both important priorities, the whole Bhagavad Gita has happened. That is Bhagavad Gita. Now we can do another 3-4 hour session on Bhagavad Gita. I actually do sessions on classes on Bhagavad Gita, but anyways. So that is Bhagavad Gita, where dhire, slowly, he's making Arjun see why choosing the society or choosing his kartavya for the larger good over the family is actually the right thing to do, although it is more difficult, although it will lead to losses, but why he still needs to do it. And how should he do it? In the way that paap aspect, he's thinking, no, mujhe paap lagega, ye hoga. He's saying, no, paap lagega. If you do it, getting fully involved and attached and personal agenda, but do it for the larger goal. Because this is what the divine will is, that is why you are in this position. So trust the divine will. Become detached and do it. So that's a process where Bhagavad Gita takes you through.
Do you believe there are a lot of lessons from Bhagavad Gita that was relevant back then is also relevant right now?
We all go through ethical dilemmas even today. Okay? Arjun's was major one. He had to go out and kill people. But yeah, look at, say, a working woman today, right? There might be few days when your child is extremely ill, but you have a big presentation which is going to define your career move, which is going to define your promotion. What do? How do you decide? Not as big as what Arjun was going through, but it's an ethical dilemma. Your entire your growth in life, your career would be fantastic if you lived in America. But you have old parents and you have limited time with them. What do? How do you choose? Is one right over the other? It's all personal for everybody, but it is an ethical dilemma, right? How do you take a call where you live with minimum regret? How do you manage that? Because kuch na kuch to hoga. They're all important priorities. Are there ways, are there mechanisms you can put in place to ensure both can be taken care of? Great. Sometimes that may not happen. Sometimes there's a conflict between what you do versus what your country does, right? You might get a lot of profit dealing with certain countries, which are your enemies. You might lose if you give those up. But then what is in the interest of your country? Again, an ethical dilemma. Is it any different today?
No.
Think of, at every point in time, we are taking decisions. When we take a decision, we are saying yes to one, no to other. Some are easy, some not. So how is it different from what Arjun is going through? And hence, Bhagavad Gita is timeless. And hence, the epics are timeless.
So the worry is majorly from the mind, right? So now, what do you think is the purpose of mind? So the mind would have been given to human beings for a specific reason, but now it's gone all haywire for us and we have started to believe we are the thoughts, we are our beliefs. So, I mean, what was the actual purpose of the mind that was given to us according to Vedas? And how is it being exploited at this point of time? And how is the mind exploiting us and our decisions?
So there's a, not completely related to what you're asking, but what you asked is taking me to this absolutely beautiful sukta in the Rig Veda. It's called Shiva Sankalpa Sukta. Yeah? And in that, the Rishi says, this mind of mine, what is this mind? I'm sitting here, but it can go as far as it wants to the space, to universe where nobody else can go. I can go to Saturn and come back, right? My mind can go, which can go as deep as it wants, which is the light of the lights. The fact that I'm talking now, what is the words that are coming to me? Where is it all coming from? From the mind somewhere, right? The thoughts are bringing it. So I'm able to, it's the light of all my senses. It is that which can go and live in the past. Okay, I can't go back. There is no time. I can't walk back in time. But my mind can. My mind can go to the future, which I can. I can't. This present moment also I am, right? This is all mind. The greatest discoveries have happened because of the mind.
Yes.
The biggest things that you see, the whole Rig Veda, it's all eventually this, right? Biggest buildings, greatest nuclear reactors, you name it, entire progress is this mind. So he keeps on saying that, oh, this is what the mind can achieve. And he says, hence, let auspicious thoughts come to my mind. Tanme mana Shiva Sankalpamastu. Shiva means auspicious. Let the best auspicious thoughts come to me. I mean, that is your field, manifestation. Right? Because this mind is so powerful.
Yeah.
This mind, that desire comes to the mind and it manifests into what I want. Hence, it reminds the mind that you are this powerful. Everything that human beings have been able to achieve is because of the mind-intellect complex. What is the difference between the animals and us? Now, the thing is, animals behave out of their natural instincts, right? Like that snake is saying that, oh, I'm just behaving as my natural instinct. I bite. I have no... The snake is not biting because it likes you or it doesn't like you, right? Had it been anybody, it would bite. It's its nature. So it's working very naturally, like Nimit Matra, as Krishna is saying. It is just becoming a Nimit. Living very naturally. We are not. Why? Because we have been given this mind. That is why we are called evolved. It is this mind which is making us the worst of criminals. It is this mind which is making us the best of scientists and the best of rishis and everything. It is all here. And the Veda says, let this mind always have auspicious thoughts. Your whole manifestation is coming from here.
Yeah, it's so true.
And hence, because this mind is so powerful, you know what Krishna says in Bhagavad Gita? In fact, not just Bhagavad Gita, the whole Ramayana, Mahabharata, everything. What did I say when I was telling you ki the lessons that I derive from it? That decision making kaisa karna hai, right? How should your decisions be? Outcome will happen. How would your decisions be? And how do you take those decisions will determine how you accept the outcome, right? But what is that how? What is that how? The how is the mind. Right? With what perspective, with what drishtikon are you acting? With what approach are you acting? That is the mind. Which means, is your mind trained enough or is it running around haywire? So what does all this come back to? Mind control. The one underlying theme in all the epics is Indriya Nigraha, Manaha Nigraha, control of the mind. That will determine the direction of your life.
And also in this entire journey, do you believe the institution of marriage, the way it is right now, is very different from how it used to be as it was depicted in the Itihasas?
I mean, what we see in the Itihas is actually what we see now also. But before that, we see in a lot of ancient cultures how the institution of marriage itself has evolved, right? In fact, we were just talking about it. Why do we need the institution of marriage to begin with? It is not as if children can happen without marriage. No?
Correct.
You just have an intercourse and the bachas will happen. You don't need a marriage for it. But then why is it that across cultures, even when there was no internet, this institution of marriage came? Why is the question, right? That leads to other level of question, which should ask us, what is the purpose of all these civilizations? Which has inherently come, which is true for us, which is true for animals and everybody. What do they all want to do? We have seen this intercourse in all animals. It's not just human beings, right? Why is that required at all? Because every species has an inherent desire and wiring to propagate itself. What is that goal? Sustenance of that race, right? Every species inherently wants to ensure continuity of its race. This is evolutionary need that has been put into us. Like for animals, same for human beings. Now, as for human beings, we have the buddhi, which means we have to take too many decisions and everything, which means we can't just survive like animals. We have Kam, Krodha, Lobha, Moha, Mad, Matsara. We have desire, we have anger, we have lust, everything, which leads to conflicts between people. Now, if people were always fighting, taking away things from each other, will we as a human race survive?
No.
So, the humans had to come together at some point when they reached a certain mass, where they said that if we want to survive and sustain, we will need to ensure there are some rules and regulations, some code of conduct between us, some separation of duties. That's how slowly, the civilizations emerged. Because what does it mean to be civil? What does it mean to have a civilization? When you have these codes of conduct, you may agree with them today, not agree with them is a different thing. Evolution, what happens, adaptation, all that is different. But this is what a civilization is, right? Where there is a chance for a peaceful existence. For the weak and the strong. The strong are not eating or not destroying the weak. So that is a civilization. In that, if people are just randomly having intercourse and randomly having a child, what would happen? See, the mother cannot run away, but the father can, na? And anyways, for this inherent need to propagate, as in animals, it is the man who has to spread around his seeds, right? So, if you see again across cultures, most have been men across, not even most, men across cultures have been polygamous, right? Over time, the monogamy has come in. But otherwise, throughout, you see, be it the Greek, Roman, Egyptian, Mesopotamian, whatever, or even our Itihas, men have been polygamous so that they could spread their seeds as much as possible. Whoever is the strongest will have more women and more seeds, right? More children. That's how it was. But the woman is stuck with having the child. Stuck in the sense that is what nature has, it is what it is, right? The gender which gives birth is the woman gender. So, now, how to ensure that the child is taken care of and the man takes responsibility of the child? For that, you need to again have a system where there is an identification ki baba, this is your child and you better take responsibility. Just having sex and going away doesn't work. There is a repercussion, there is a responsibility which comes with it. That is how the institution of marriage would have come into being.
Okay.
Right? In a way, it sort of ties down the man from his natural instincts to take responsibility so that the child, one, of course, you need for the propagation of the species,
Correct.
but also you need that child to have a stable childhood so that he grows up to be of value to the society.
Right.
Right? That is what the institution of marriage does. In our Itihas, it is called Grahasthashram. Okay, so in the Indic view, we talk of the phases of life as 4. We call it ashram. It starts with brahmacharya, which is the youngest when the children are children. That is the time when they have to get the sanskaras in the sense the right value systems and all of that. Study, vocational education, so that they can grow up to have some skills, so that they can earn all of that, right? That is the student phase. Then you grow up, you get married. You get married and you actually work. So all the resource generation, the money, the wealth, the food, vagere, all that happens in the Grahasthashram, which is the married institution. Propagation of race as well as generation of resources. Then you have what is called Vanprastha. After you have had your children, after you've created all resources and everything, now it's the turn of your children to carry that on. So you take a step back. Basically today what we say, retire. Today we retire from professions, but ghar pe we still want our authority, right? That's not how it was. You give up everything and now you focus on your spiritual goals and all of that.
Okay.
Eventually you become old enough and you prepare yourself to die. That's how it used to be. But what they say is that this Grahasthashram was the most important. Why? Because the other 3, students, retired, what do they depend on? This Grahasthashram, no?
Right.
Resource generation happens on that.
Right.
They are the ones who take care of everybody else. They are the ones who ensure that the society goes on. You see some of these countries where the fertility rate has dropped and the issues it is creating, right? You have only old people, no young people getting born. And that is actually skewing the society completely, economy, everything. So you need a healthy TFR. You need a healthy fertility rate to ensure your species is carried on. That was what the Grahasthashram did. And this Grahasthashram is the Sanskrit name for the institution of marriage.
Right.
So this is how I see things would have evolved.
And this brings me to the next question. So which is, as human beings or any species, I mean, the goal of evolution is to make sure that the species don't die, right? So now, in the society that there is right now, a lot of people choose not to have children for convenience. Is this us going against evolution in itself?
In some sense, yes, right? Because from the idea of Grahasthashram and the evolutionary instinct that the species has to carry forward. But then, if I think of it in a different way, could it also be the evolutionary germ that's getting into our heads to say, Baba, this is too much now don't procreate? I don't know, right? But in spirit, yes.
Okay.
Now, why is that happening? Because there is this conflict between social and individual. By and large, when you talk of civilizations, individual had a role to play, but it was more communal. In the sense, the communal goals were always larger than the individual. Today, what has happened? Today, the individual has become the core of everything. My wish, my ye, my likings, my dislikings. It's all come to my versus my community, my society, my country, right? That conflict has started happening and we are becoming more and more and more individualistic. So hence all of this. Now you will always go through these phases. Now what has happened with more and more individualism, more depression, more anxiety, people feeling lonely. Now, and social media, internet is sort of aiding that. People do things like, recently I read a news report where a man got married to a doll or robots or whatever, right? Because eventually we still, given that we are human beings, we still need company.
Yeah.
We are social animal, come what may. So we are in that phase right now. Now what are people saying? People are building community houses. People are saying, okay, how do we get together? How do we move out? So that's going on. So this keeps happening. Phases of life.
So based on how we are supposed to live, according to the Shastras, and how we are living right now, what do you think are the major differences and which is leading into a lot of depression and anxiety?
I think, see, Shastras, when we say living according to the Shastras, Shastras give us major, as I said, framework. Now, what is that framework? The framework is, as I spoke about the 4 ashrams, the other aspect of the Indic view is Chaturvida Purushartha. So, Purushartha means the pursuits of life. Okay. What are these broad pursuits of life? I had actually already mentioned dharma, artha, kama, moksha. Artha, resource generation, which we are all doing, I think, more than ever before.
Yes.
Girls, boys, everybody, right? So that is happening. Kama, pleasure. Both of this has to be on the substratum of dharma. In the sense, it has to be regulated. It has to be for the larger good. And not just the larger good, your own good. Otherwise, you will earn, eventually waste all of that in your hospitalization because you've never done anything else. All pleasure, indulgences, again, you end up being nowhere else, right? So it has to be on the substratum of dharma, or it has to be regulated by dharma. What is dharma? Those actions which allow sustenance of yourself and the larger society around, which means it has to be controlled and for the good, right? Not exploitative. This was the framework of life, and it also said, don't forget the spiritual aspect in your material journey, which is your emotional, physical, spiritual growth, all of that, because that is required. If you see the Maslow's hierarchy also, our Shastra are saying exactly the same thing. To a certain extent, you will get a dopamine hit from a lot of money, sex, all of that. But beyond that, what? When you have all of that, you're still lost for meaning. And that's when you seek realization, community, service, all of that, right? So all this is important. Our Shastras say, let your life be governed by these four. Work for all of this. Now, how could change with time? Today, it is possible that somebody just can't get married, right? It's not in everybody's hand. So that aspect of procreation may not happen. Does it mean it's a failure?
No.
No, that person might be doing a lot of service for the community, working with others. Maybe not taking care of own children, but giving education to 10 others, right? Might be creating resources, might be doing social service. So everybody's path is also different. What is important is not to become dogmatic about the structure.
Okay.
कि ऐसा ही होना चाहिए. This is how you don't get married, you are a waste. No, ऐसा भी नहीं है. ठीक है? Or I just want to enjoy and not take any responsibilities. That never works, because that enjoyment is that lower level of Maslow's hierarchy. Eventually, you will come back to realize that you need people around you, and people will be around you when you also have something to give. You just can't live a selfish existence, right? So it's a struggle between this. The larger understanding, if we have dharma, artha, kama, moksha, where you say, okay, fine, even if somebody is single, can they still get involved with people, live a life which is more worthwhile? That's fine. Right? So it's not the structure, but the values which are important. And I feel like this whole Chaturvida Purushartha model is absolutely fantastic for that.
So now coming to the entire episode of Ramayana, no? Can you help us understand the essence of what happened and why it happened, and what are the lessons that we can learn from that?
Okay. So Ramayana, as we know, is the story of Sri Ram. Sri Ram was Raja, or rather, he was the prince of Ayodhya, son of Dashrath and Kaushalya, and very good son. Not just a very good son, also a very good warrior. People of Ayodhya loved him. And with the, it was everybody's desire in Ayodhya that he should become the next king after his father. And it was almost done. But at the very last, on the day of his coronation, something happens, which is his stepmother, Kaikeyi, suddenly decides that she wants the kingdom for her son and not Ram. Her son Bharat is younger to Ram. Okay. And she forces the Raja to exile Ram. So this is literally like, in the next hour, he could have become the Raja, versus now he has to leave Ayodhya, go and live in the forest for 14 years.
On what pretext? Just the father says this and he leaves?
Because the stepmother had once upon a time, the stepmother had saved the king's life. And the king had said, you ask me for a boon and I'll give you whatever you want. She hadn't asked anything at that time. Okay, so here is a Raja. Again, now there is an ethical dilemma. He has made a promise to his people that he will make Ram the king. He has made a promise to his wife long back that I'll do whatever you want me to do. Once his promise to the people has made, now this queen is asking, but my promise, and my promise is throw him away, ask him to go and give the kingdom to my son. Okay, that is what has happened. Again, ethical dilemma. Should he do what he has promised to his people, or should he listen to his queen? What is the right thing to do? He chooses chooses to kya, she sort of forces him and he gives in. That okay, I have to keep my word because truth is truth. I have to keep my word, and he doesn't say anything. And she in fact tells Sri Ram that you have to go to exile. So this man who was just going to be the Raja is now sent to exile. But his wife Sita, they're both deeply, madly in love. She says that I will accompany you, come what may. I know this is going to be very tough, this is very dangerous. But if you don't live in the palace, I don't live in the palace. Whatever hardships you go through, I go through. So she supports him and she goes. Although he tells her that, Baba, don't come, it's going to be tough out there. But she's like, no, I'll come. And his younger brother. So they are 4 brothers, yeah. This is the younger brother, Lakshman, who's the son of another stepmother. He's very dedicated to his elder brother. He also chooses to accompany them. So 3 of them, Ram, Lakshman and Sita, they go to the forest. Now, it's a 14-year exile. And in that 14 years, the first 13 years are actually very nice. No problems whatsoever. As in the hardships of the forest life is obviously there. And some incidents happen here and there. All that is fine. But then, something happens with this lady called Shurpanakha. She sees these people in the forest and she sees Ram and she falls for him. She's like completely smitten by him. And she wants to marry him. Now Ram is like, I'm already married, and he was just some random woman comes up to you, so you don't marry, right? So he's like, oh, maybe you ask my brother. The brother says, no, you ask her. So they were just having some fun, right? Because the way she came. She feels that it is because of this lady Sita that they both are rejecting me.
Okay.
So she tries to kill Sita. Now when she tries to kill Sita, Sri Ram is obviously angry if somebody is doing this to your wife, and he tells Lakshman to punish her. Now once she's punished, she becomes angry. And she rushes to, first she gets other brothers to attack Ram. Ram kills the entire army because he's a very, very brave warrior. Then she goes and complains to Ravan, who's the king of Lanka, who is extremely lustful. If he sees a woman he likes, he needs to get her. Okay. Powerful king, had done a lot of worship and all that and gotten boons and stuff. But that boon had made him extremely proud, extremely egoistical, and he believed that whichever woman he liked, he could just have her. Shurpanakha plays on that, tells him that there is this beautiful lady out there who you deserve to have, and she describes her. And when she does, Ravan is like, oh, I need this woman. So he goes and captures her when Ram and Lakshman are away. So they play a game, they set up a trap for them and then capture Sita and come. Now Sri Ram doesn't know where Sita is.
Okay.
And he's absolutely devastated because he's madly in love with his wife. Now what to do? They don't know where Sita is. They don't know how to go. They don't know how they'll rescue her, nothing. So then there is this journey from Sri Ram making an alliance with another king, Sugriv, who was also being exiled and whose wife was also taken away by his elder brother.
Okay.
So they have a pact, they become friends, they become allies more than friends, where Ram helps rescue his wife and gets him the kingdom. And Sugriv has said, I will help you find Sita and get her. So then they come together and eventually they somehow reach Lanka. There's a big war that happens. Finally, Ravan is dead and Sitaji is rescued and they come back. So this is the story. But at every point again, like Dashrath goes to various dilemmas, you will see that in various points, even in this journey. So eventually it boils down to the same thing. What do you do when you are faced with ethical dilemmas?
Do you think Ram was also put in a lot of ethical dilemmas in the process?
Lots. First was from the very beginning, when the father said, you are exiled. Now, exile is a punishment, no? Why should he take the punishment? Had he done anything wrong?
No.
Right? So it was wrong. It was ethically wrong in that sense for his father to exile him away just to satisfy his wife. He could have said, "Na, Baba, truth and all that is one side of it, but you don't interfere with my job as a Raja. You can ask me whatever else related to you." Right? He could have done that, but he gives in because he's very, very involved with this wife of his. So what should Sri Ram do? Should he listen to his dad for the heck of listening to his dad? Or should he fight back as was his right? Because he was not wrong, he was not punished. And Lakshman actually tells him, what should he do at that point? Starting from there, when they come to Chitrakoot, and by that time, so this happens in the first year itself, when his father has died now, okay, because he cannot take the separation and all that, so the father dies. Bharat, for whom his stepmother had asked for the kingdom, Kaikeyi had asked for the kingdom, he doesn't want it. He feels extremely bad for all the scheming that his mother has done, and he comes to Chitrakoot to take Ram back. Now the thing is, the father is dead. Bharat is saying, I don't want the kingdom. Should he go back or should he not go back? Should he keep the word given to his father? Or now that the father is dead, should he go back? In fact, he's told that. He said, your father is dead now. What is the promise for? You come back. It would have been the easier way out. So what should he do in that time? That is an ethical dilemma. Then some rishis come to him and they say that the demons here, the Rakshasas here are troubling us. You have to fight them. Sita says, you are not here as the Raja. You're not here you've come to live here as a rishi here, as a tapasvi here, right? Why should you fight? And anyways, those Rakshasas have not done anything wrong to you. Why should you fight? So should he do his dharma as a warrior? Or should he just continue live in the forest as anybody else, leaving these rishis to their own thing?
Is there also another perspective that if Ram had done everything that what others wanted him to do, Ravan wouldn't have gotten killed in this journey, and the purpose of this entire journey was for Ravan to get killed?
So, if you see the way Sri Ram takes a call in the first place itself, because when he's told that you should be exiled or you have to go away and leave everything and go away, he says, Eva Mastu, okay, I'll go. Lakshman is not happy with that. Lakshman says, how? You've done nothing wrong. And as Kshatriyas, we are taught that what matters is justice, right? So even if our father is unjust or a Raja is unjust, you have to respond and you cannot accept injustice. This is just wrong. So you should not go away. If we need, we should even fight our dad. That's what he's saying. We should even capture our dad. Sri Ram says no. And then he explains why he's accepting the exile. Usually what we are told is because his father said as an obedient kid, he just runs away. This is one side of it. He says this is one reason, because at the end of the day, he's not just our father, he's also the king. So as a citizen and a son, I should listen to him. But there is another thing. He says, till date, I have not done anything that would make Kaikeyi, my stepmother, so upset with me that she wants to harm me. I have always treated her like my own mother. And till now, she has also not treated me that way. She has loved me. But suddenly, her brain has become so corrupt that she wants to harm me. She could have just said, give the Rajya to Bharat and let me stay here. But that is also not it. She wants me to be out of this kingdom, right? She wants me to suffer. This whole situation is just not making sense. Okay. He says, akasmikam asankalpitam. This whole situation that has emerged, how is that? I would have been the Raja in the next hour, right? And it has not come as a surprise, so to say, to everybody, because people loved him and they wanted him. But suddenly, things have changed. And how? Which doesn't really have a logic or a rationale. Based on there was no past data to show this has happened.
Right.
He says, the way things have emerged, I believe that this is a hand of destiny. Okay. It just seems like this destiny is trying to take me on some path beyond what I can see right now. And what that path is, I will only know if I don't fight it right now and I accept it. Right? Now, does that mean you don't fight injustice? No, it doesn't. Because what comes here is that who are you fighting with? One. And second, how the situation has emerged. If his father was always unjust, if the mother was always unjust, yes, he could have done whatever. But here, that's not the case. And how it has happened. He's like, clearly, basically what he's saying is, this is a lesson in how to deal with failure. You've done everything right? You've put in all your effort and things have not gone according to what you wanted. Then what do? Do you keep fighting on that? Or you say, okay, fine, maybe this door is closed and I went through all this so that some other door opens and that is going to take me even further, right? He says, let me see where this is going. Because clearly it seems like, whatever has happened is not making sense to me right now. Let's see where this goes. So this is how he's thinking about it.
Which is very interesting because there's no logic to how things are orchestrated. And he's like, there's something else beyond this. Let me take that path.
Correct.
Which is very interesting.
Okay, stepmother is saying whatever, but even my father, who otherwise loves me so much, actually, and he's a great Raja. Dashrath has been a very good Raja. His buddhi is also really not thinking clearly at that time, right? That what is the real job of his, or what is the real path for him to take. His buddhi is also not thinking clearly. He's like, okay, maybe then I should just accept it for now and see where this goes.
And what happens after 14 years once he comes back?
So he becomes a Raja again. Okay, so now even when they come back, now Sita has been taken away, right? So there is ethical dilemma for Sita also when Hanumanji comes to Lanka and says, you come back with me. So now she has to decide whether she comes back or she waits for Ram to come and take her away and kill Ravan. So that she has to take a call. When eventually Ram comes and kills Ravan, now the thing is, the wife has stayed with some other man for so long. Today, we know and trust what the truth is. But when Ravan took her away, there was nobody around, right? There were no drones, there was no spying, nobody knows what happened. People can always say, oh, she wanted to go on her own. Who are you to say? And there were a lot of women in this guy's harem. Lots of women. He had women all around him. He was just absolutely lustful individual, Ravan. So when they were going to go back, Sita was not just his wife, right? Like any ordinary person. She was going to go back as the queen. He was going to go back as the king because the father had died and Bharat anyways was waiting for them to come back. Now, when you are in that position of leadership, and at that time when the Raja was considered, Raja's word was justice, right? How do you keep the credibility of the people to show them that yes, you matter to me more than everybody else, right? For those standards for both the Raja and the Rani, because they're both together in it, right? So here the Raja can play his Raj Dharma only when the Rani also does the Raj Dharma. Kaikai didn't. And see what happened, right? So both of them are together. Both of them have an accountability towards the society. So then he has to he has to decide how should he behave with Sita when she comes back so that people don't question her character. So he makes her go through that Agni Pariksha. Not because he doesn't trust her. He has done all this just for her. He was madly, madly in love. And that romance of... So one of the most beautiful parts of Ramayana is the love story of Sita and Sri Ram. And that is very rarely spoken of. It's a beautiful love story, the way they are madly in love with each other. You know, I don't think anybody has picturized it also, the way they were madly in love. But anyways, so he has done all this only for her. He was behaving like a madman when he realized that Sita has been kidnapped, yeah. He keeps crying, he keeps falling unconscious and stuff, and it's Lakshman who has helped him stay strong over the 1 year of finding Sita ji. But then, at that point, he has to decide whether he just accepts his wife who's now going to be Raja, who's going to be a queen, or should he behave in a way that she herself is provoked into answering the questions which may be asked on later on, right? So he behaves in that way, and he later on, when she proves herself and all that, he says, I never questioned her. I had not even an iota of doubt on her character, but I knew that people will question. And like Sita chose to stay in Lanka. Why? Instead of coming back with Hanumanji, because she knew that if she comes back with Hanumanji, what will people say? See, the husband couldn't even take care of her. He couldn't even rescue her. People would have questioned Ram's character. Hence, Sita chose to stay in Lanka and go through that ordeal for some more time and get Ram to come there instead. Similarly, he chooses to go through the ordeal of putting her through that Agni Pariksha because he doesn't want people to question her character, right? Even in that, they're only thinking about each other. Not about, oh, how will history judge me? No. The concern is how should people not question her or put any stigma on her character, and she's thinking about him, right? So all that happens. Finally, it's a nice happy ending. They come back to Ayodhya and become the Raja and the Rani and live happily ever after. So the Yuddha Kand ends there.
Okay.
Then there is this aspect of Uttarkand. And there's a huge controversy about what happens after they become Raja Rani. So there is this part in Ramayana which is called Uttarkand. And this Uttarkand, a lot of people say, is actually not a part of the original Ramayana at all. It was inserted much later. There are others who believe it was probably a part of Ramayana. And the issue with that is that in that they show that even after coming back, the people of Ayodhya, like all of them, they still question the character of Sita. And at that time, because again, as I said, Sita is not just any random woman. She is the Rani herself, right? So, for the sake of the people, unlike what his father did, Sri Ram chooses to let his wife go. However, he doesn't get married again. At that time, polygamy was a norm. All Rajas had multiple wives. He lets the queen go, but he never leaves the wife. Even the yagnas and everything he does with her image. Yeah. Showing to the people that, yeah, you didn't trust the queen, I have let her go. But my wife will always only be her. Right? So but it's a very sad episode because we know that Sita was never at fault, right? And still she's being questioned. And Sri Ram has to do what he has to do because it's a bigger ethical dilemma to choose what your people want, who have waited for you all these years, who consider you to be God, and you want them to trust your word, right? And not do what your father did, choose the wife over the praja. So that also was probably lingering on his mind. But let this lady go who is the love of your life. She also understands that. So she doesn't ever question that decision of Sri Ram. Yeah, she's upset. But she knows that for him to live his Raj Dharma, she also has to live that Raj Dharma. It's a combined effort,
Yes.
right? So then she gives birth to twins, Love and Kush. And eventually when they're old enough, they somehow come back. But she chooses to not come back. She says, enough. I have done my role as a queen, as a mother, as a wife. Now you keep your children. Now I don't want another test of character. I am leaving. I now choose my self-respect. And she decides to. The scene is that the earth opens up and she's the daughter of the earth anyways. Bhumija, she's called. And she chooses to leave. So it's a very intense end if you consider the Uttarkand. If you consider Yuddhakand as the end, then it's all happy ending.
Okay.
But again, you see, the theme is ethical dilemma. The theme is ethical dilemma throughout. How do you take a decision when faced with conflicting priorities?
And for everybody who's watching, what would you like to tell?
First of all, I would say keep an open mind to read about the epics. The epics are not just meant for us to judge our past, or judge our ancestors. They are meant for us to learn lessons from our life, for our lives, yeah? Also, especially with respect to Itihas, what has happened is, as I mentioned before, a lot of fiction, retellings, everything has come, which has muddled our understanding for it. Because everybody says, oh, I'm writing from this person's perspective, that person's perspective. How do you know the perspectives? Right? Unless you are saying you are Valmiki and Vedvyas.
Yes.
Right? So, fiction is great. As a genre of literature, enjoy it. But if you genuinely have questions, take the effort to go back to the original. That is why the books I have written, I'm not saying they're retellings or anything. I've just tried to go back to the original and present what our rishis wanted to tell us. That's at least been my attempt. So the 3 books I have on Mahabharata Ramayana. So one is, if you have genuine questions, make an effort to seek genuinely. Don't be happy with convenient answers. Also, just because it is old, it is great. Or just because it is new, it is bad. Or the other way around, just because it is old, it is all bad. Just because it's new, it's good. That is the very wrong approach to deal with anything in life. Good or bad has to be dealt with your intelligence and analysis of what does it do to you at that point in time. Approach the past, approach the epics, approach the value systems and everything with that perspective. And also read your epics. I think there's so much for us to learn.
That's true. And you have a very, very beautiful knack of storytelling and it just keeps people glued. I mean, I understand all of this in bits and pieces. It's not my forte, but I really, really enjoyed our conversation. The depth that you have, the work that you've done, and the way you orchestrate everything with such beautiful narration. Thank you so much. This was such a delightful conversation.
Thank you.
And I'm sure everybody who's watching this also
I
will
have to tell
experience.
you, I've done a lot of podcasts, right? But this one was different. I think it comes from where you are coming. It was not just, tell me about Mahabharata Ramayana. The way you weaved in the questions to take it to a very different level. So I also enjoyed the conversation.
That's so sweet. Thank you so much. It was lovely having you here.
Thank you.